Greetings everyone, I am Don151.
And I'm Mekkah.
We are bringing to you once again Chapter 17 of my Marcus Emblem 7 Marcus Hard Mode Marcus % Gross playthrough. Or at least, that's definitely how it's felt like so far, based on how hard Marcus has been carrying this run. And this chapter is no exception. It merely serves to prove that point, because this is one of those classic GBA Fire Emblem maps, where we have a long waiting corridor that has a lot of enemies in the way that we can't really avoid, and we just have to romp through with Marcus leading the way, and with everyone else following.
Yeah, the reason that is because this chapter's enemy density is pretty high, and the corridors are too tight to really piece together kills like we've been doing in the early chapters, so we just have to rely on Marcus's enemy phase. So that means using a paladin with a javelin and a hand axe equipped. Pretty normal FE7 strategy. What's not going to be normal is a turn 1 strategy. We're bringing a bunch of weird units and weapons to take care of the initial wave of enemies. We're using 2 steel lances, which are generally considered pretty bad. We're using an iron blade, and we put it on Florina of all people who can't even use it. We also gave Florina a heavy spear to take care of this knight initially. And what's even worse is we're going to leave Florina in range of an enemy archer. Now that is pretty bad. But what I think is even worse and more offensive to me is that Don didn't watch that episode of Fire Emblem Pitfalls, where I used this exact point to demonstrate why you should be trading weapons after attacking. Because while these initial enemies you want to kill with one-range weapons like he's been doing, and that went fine, he forgot to trade around javelins and hand axes to the top of his inventory so that he could counter all these archers in this corridor, but I think he just missed that episode altogether.
Please, Mekkah, do not offend me like that. Of course I saw that episode, and of course I understand the importance of trading weapons prior to enemy phase, but in this specific instance, we can get away without doing it. And certainly, there are many points in this playthrough where I think I've shown that sometimes it's worth stumbling into these pitfalls on purpose, because you might get a better outcome afterwards. So we are going to be able to counter one Cavalier with Marcus, but Mekkah is right that all of the other archers are going to go uncountered. That's not really a big deal because most of them are mounted units, are just going to blaze right past, and they're no longer going to be a problem for us. The really interesting thing about the archers here at the beginning is that the ones on the left have steel bows and are lower level than the ones on the right, who have iron bows and are at a higher level. So those guys on the left are actually pretty easy to one round, and they're also the ones that we need to take care of on our way to that treasure room in the bottom left.
So normally in the Seas map you pick up the Lord as soon as possible, but we actually left Hector out here to do some work. He would have died if we hadn't given the Draco Shield last chapter, but because we have him out here still, and we did give him that Draco Shield, we can use him to pick off this Nomad using the Wolf Beal. 2 times effectiveness in FE7 is usually not sufficient to kill enemies, as was demonstrated by Florina surviving that Iron Bow Archer with 2 HP. She would have died in the Japanese version where you have triple effectiveness, but Hector here can one-shot this Nomad, and he can also one-shot some Lance Cavalier sometimes, but not always, depends on the level. From here on out, Guy and Matthew are going to head to the treasure room on the left to pick up an unlock staff and a hero crest, both of which are going to be useful. They're especially useful in a 0% growth context, although with Matthew going there, I'm not sure how we're going to pick up the northern treasure room, because Matthew is only one person and we don't have any chest keys, just door keys that we bought last chapter. But at least we're going to get the hero crest, which is really important, right?
Yes, because in this chapter we also recruit a hero crest user whose name is Raven. He's kind of like a angsty, I don't know, he's kind of like fits the Rutger or Navarre personality archetype, but not really the unit class. But anyway, he's a mercenary on the screen, kind of standing below that archer, and we can recruit him with Priscilla. Raven is considered by casual players, especially in like the old Game FAQs days, and also kind of in the new Game FAQs days, if I'm going to be completely honest. He's considered by them to be a really good unit in this game, and it's no surprise why, because he has pretty good base stats, and they're very combat oriented. He has really good strength, skill, speed, bases, and also growths. And if you kind of train him in a casual playthrough and promote him, he's going to be your best combat unit by a fairly decent margin. In a more efficient setting though, Raven's drawback is that he's not mounted, and so therefore he's not nearly as useful as someone like Sane or Kent, who can be trained up to be functionally nearly as good as Raven, but also just a lot more mobile. But we're going to use Raven a lot in this playthrough because everyone else aside from Marcus is kind of a scrub, and we need to use Raven's stats. One of his drawbacks though is that he has a very low base level of 5, and we need to get him promoted for chapter 20, and that's going to be one of the most challenging parts of this playthrough coming up.
Unfortunately, Raven doesn't have much time to train in this chapter because he has a side objective to fulfill. He has to recruit Lucius, the green monk that's positioned in the cell with all the green soldiers. Lucius, for the purposes of 0% growth, is just an infinitely better version of Urk because his bases are higher, and in promotion, Urk gets E rank stabs, but Lucius gets C rank, so he's just much more useful that way. The only thing about recruiting Lucius in a low turn count playthrough is that the green soldiers are positioned in such a way that makes it really annoying for Raven to get there in time. We actually have to rescue drop him to make it. Speaking of those green soldiers, we have to keep at least one of them alive to unlock the guy in chapter after this, and depending on how many we keep alive exactly, you get a different reward. Speedruns, not LTCs, actually like to keep alive exactly one soldier, so they purposely kill off 2 of them in order to get the mine. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to murder any of them, so we are just stuck with the red gem instead for keeping 3 of them alive.
So as we're meandering about these long hallways, it seems like we wasted a couple points of movement with Marcus by having him step around a couple of enemies. But this isn't anything to worry about. It doesn't affect our turn count in the end, because in this chapter, even if Marcus were to move completely unobstructed at his full movement every single turn, carrying Hector, and drop him as close to the throne as possible, Hector would still be 1 tile short of seizing the throne. So at first glance, it doesn't seem like there's any way to beat this chapter faster than 7 turns. But there actually are a couple of methods to 6 turn this chapter that I want to cover because they're pretty interesting. The first method involves using a Limbo Paladin, either a promoted Saint or Kent, and it uses a technique that I like to call the paladin scooch. You see these in similar long winding chapters like FE6 chapter 8 or FE8 chapter 8, where one paladin picks up another and then moves their full movement the next turn and drops them 1 tile ahead. And that 1 tile is enough to make up for whatever Hector is short of seizing the throne on turn 6. The other method to 6 turn this chapter is a bit more complicated, and it uses what I like to call a 3-step shuffle. Basically, it uses 2 Cavaliers and Marcus to advance Marcus 1 tile in the span of like 3 turns. It's kind of complicated to explain, but if you want to see that strategy in action, you should look at an LTC of FE8 chapter 5X, where they basically do that to move Orson 1 extra tile on the 2nd turn.
The other thing that makes the 6th turn a lot more difficult to do is that we have to do every single side objective a turn earlier. For example, Raven making it to Lucius by turn 6 is pretty difficult to do without any additional rescue drop support. Getting the upper treasure room is hard even for casual players, let alone a 6th turn completion. Racing the thieves to the treasure can be very challenging. Fortunately, only one of the thieves has any keys. The other one, the second one that came out, he just has an iron sword and a killing edge, and he just kind of runs away or tries to steal your stuff. In this case, he actually takes the lockpick. And what that means is that if you said that this lockpick was the key all along, you were right, because that lockpick lets us get both Silver Sword, that is very important for Raven's offense later on, and the Knight Crest, which we need to promote Lowen after he reaches level 10 in this map. The reason this works is because both thieves will drop an item after they take a treasure, and normally the first thief ends up taking both, so we'll only drop one of them. But now next turn, on turn 7, both thieves will be having 1 treasure, and we can kill both and get both items.
I don't know how many people saw through that, but of course I wouldn't steal the wrong item in such a tightly planned playthrough. One other item that we had carried along for most of this chapter that plays a role at the very end is Iron Blade that we gave to Florina, and this is so that she could pass it off to Raven after he's recruited and he can 1-round the archer with it. This is not because of the power or anything of that sort. It's actually because the Iron Blade is special in that it's the only sword we have right now that gives double weapon EXP per use. FE7 is the first game in which some weapons can give more than 1 weapon EXP per use in combat, and that means that we can have an easier time training up Raven's sword rank, because in order for him to be able to use that silver sword after he promotes to a hero, he needs to grind up his weapon rank in addition to his experience. The other thing that I want to point out is Hector's survival in the throne room, which also required a specific setup. It's not nearly as complicated as the survival near the gate in the prior chapter, but it does involve some AM manipulation. We equipped Hector with a hand axe so that the knights with javelins preferred to attack Marcus, who was equipped with a hammer instead. And that hammer that we picked up early in this chapter finally allows us to kill an armored boss without resorting to a silly low % critical. Because for whatever reason, this general boss is slower than the Armor Knight boss in the prior chapter, even though he's promoted. And he's slow enough so that Marcus can double him, even though he's weighed down by the hammer.
We actually managed to sneak in some EXP on Lucius in this chapter. Normally when I play this map, there is no way he's going to see any combat because he's so far away from it, but in this instance he managed to sneak in a hit on a knight through the wall of the throne room and the prison. He's got to get to level 10 somehow, just like Lowen, who managed to do it on the last turn. And that is chapter 17, completed in 7 turns. We will see you next time.
See ya.